Hey, hope y'all are doing well. I know that you guys are so disappointed that we don't get to have class in person, but I wanted to give you all some of the notes for this week. It breaks my heart that we are not together for our American history. It's one of my favorite subjects, obviously, and I would love to have more time. But guys, I'm just going to highlight some things. We would spend all week discussing this. I recommend that when you do get back to check out chapter 17 to read it. You will not have homework assigned to you this week based on this. I know you guys are again disappointed with that. But next week we'll cover kind of a little bit of chapter 17, but then we got to get through all of 18, and then you've got a test next Friday on chapters 17 and 18. So just be prepared for that. All right, guys, I'm going to be reading some stuff right out of our textbook from chapter 17. You're going to get a quiz with 10 questions, and I'm going to try to tell you exactly what those 10 questions are, okay? So let's first start off by chapter 17. We went through some of this last week in 17.3, but I just want to remind you all during the early parts of the colonies, that's all there were. You had 13 original colonies. You guys can see the map of that in your textbooks. And like I said, I know most of y'all did not take these home with you. I don't blame you. I didn't take mine home with me either. Just so happened to run to the school today to pick up this copy of it just for you. So I'm not expecting you all to have those 13 colonies memorized. I will say, though, that might appear in some way on your test. So be prepared for that next week. I'll go over that with you all next week, though. All right, so you had these original 13 colonies. They're unique because Britain didn't set them up this way, but they established for themselves their own charters, their own governors. They're getting used to kind of running themselves. And so it wasn't uncommon to see yourself as a member of like the British kingdom, but also see yourself as a Virginian, or also see yourself as a person, a Georgian, somebody from these individual states. I should also point out that none of these states really see themselves as, even after the Revolutionary War, as the United States of America. They see themselves first as members of their individual state, and then later part of the United States. And that's going to change, of course, as history goes on. By the way, guys, I'm covering what I spend 3 or 4 months talking about in my U.S. history class. I'm covering all that in less than 20 minutes. So hang with me. Let me just give you some of the highlights here. So obviously, England and King George, they would like things run their way. They kind of come down hard on the American subjects. One of the reasons for that is because of the results of the French and Indian War. Now, in some ways, the French and Indian War ended up being a good thing for the colonies because it trained them for battle. It trained them for what is coming. We see names like George Washington appear in this time period. He rises up as a hero of the French and Indian War, which was fought primarily, or at least started, on American soil. That's going to move over to Europe later on, but y'all don't need to know that. But of course, this is also not a good thing, because the British are going to see the expensiveness of this war, and they're like, we got to pay for this war somehow. And so they say, well, that needs to fall on the colonies since it was fought on their soil. So we were doing this basically for them. And of course, the people of the colonies are upset by this. Last week, we talked about the Stamp Acts and other acts that the colonists did not like, they didn't agree with. That's all going to come to a head. And of course, it's going to lead to many, many problems. One of the big issues is going to rise up when Britain is basically going to create a monopoly for the East Indian Trading Company. East Indian Trading Company, it was basically told to them that they could control the surplus of tea that was shipped to and from the American colonies, which basically set up the American colonies to have to pay for this one type of tea that was priced unfairly, according to them. Some of the colonies got so fed up with this that they sent the tea back to England. Some of them let the tea come to the docks, but then they refused to unload the tea, so it would go bad. But in Boston, in that area, basically what happened is that the leaders, the royal governor who was in charge of that area, he was like, no, we're going to take this tea from England because I'm submitting to their authority. So on December 16th, 1773, a group of American patriots disguised as Indians, they boarded these vessels with the tea on it, and they threw all the tea out into the Boston Harbor. This, of course, we label this as the Boston Tea Party, and it's significant for a few reasons. It's significant because it's going to be one of those sparks for starting the Revolutionary War. There's going to be a quiz question on that, guys. You need to know the Boston Tea Party. Most of this information is available to you online. I challenge you all to use those resources. But of course, if you can remember that, if you want to watch this video again, by all means do so. But Boston Tea Party was one of the very first things that I wanted you all to know about. And that is going to set off the events that follow. So I should point out the First Continental Congress met in September of 1774. At this First Continental Congress, they basically list out their grievances with the king and with England. The pleas of the colonists, however, were refused. Parliament and George III, King George, basically says, well, I don't care about your grievances. You all are declaring these rebellions against the king and against England, against Great Britain. And so this is, again, going to be leading up to the Revolutionary War. In 1775, we get to the battles of Lexington and Concord. This is, of course, the scene of the shot heard around the world, the very famous shot heard around the world. I'd love to spend more time on this in class, guys. I wish that I could, but the reality of it is we're limited on time. You need to know that it started with the shot heard around the world. We don't know who fired the first shot. But it doesn't matter because these events are what's going to lead to the War of Independence or the Revolutionary War, and your book refers to that as both titles. It should be pointed out that there were other attempts at reconciliation. There was another meeting of the Continental Congress, the second meeting of the Continental Congress, where they wrote up again what they were upset with. They kind of lay out the history of how things got to the point that they did. But it's interesting because they ended up like trying to reconcile and moderate and fix the broken relationship here. So they were actually leaving opening the door for the colonies to stay under the authority of the British king. But the problem was the British king saw this already as a rebellion, and he basically said, no, this is going to either lead to your submission or to your independence. So the line had already been drawn in the sand. It should also be pointed out during this time period, George Washington emerges as this great hero. He was already well known for his successes during the French and Indian War, and so he was a natural choice for the colonies to choose as their commander-in-chief over the army. Not long after this, the Declaration of Independence was signed. In July 4th, 1776. As you guys know, I don't make you memorize a lot of dates, but that is a date you will need to know. July 4th, 1776, that was the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It was the most unique document written up till this point by human hands in world history. It set the precedent for the political principles that would go from this point on. So, yeah, that's pretty important. And we've got a copy of that in the room. When you guys get back, you can take a look at that and study that, of course, as well. War lasted for a couple of years. It ended in 1781, 5 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed. You guys can study this. America was pretty much the underdogs throughout most of the war. They were able to maintain the home field advantage. Their soldiers were, of course, a lot more motivated than British soldiers who didn't really understand why they were fighting this war to begin with. America basically outlasted the British and were able to win the final battles of this war. Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. There was still conflict between the Americans and the British. The British are going to continue to exert some of their power in the area. It's going to lead to another war, much lesser known by many of you, the War of 1812, which I'll get to in a few minutes. After the war, the Revolutionary War ended. They needed a government. So the very first form of government that Americans came up with is something called the Articles of Confederation. That's in your book. It's going to be a quiz question. Just want to point that out to you all. It's a very important subject. Articles of Confederation were basically an attempt to allow the states to pretty much run themselves. You could see why our forefathers were nervous about establishing a really strong, central, powerful government. They were nervous with that. They just overthrown tyrannical government and their king. And so they were hesitant. So they set up this Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation, though, didn't open things up, or it didn't make things really possible as far as like trading with other countries or even trading within the states. It left a lot to be wanted in the areas of individual property. The nation was weak and it was divided. Again, people aren't seeing themselves as American citizens. They're seeing themselves as a part of the states, individual states. So it needed to be scrapped right away. There were other reasons for that, Shays Rebellion, which your book doesn't talk about. But there's a lot of reasons for this. So eventually they came back together. They met at the Constitutional Convention at Independence Hall in Philadelphia in 1787. James Madison was one of the leaders who oversaw that. And he basically him and his fellow delegates set out to set up this, what was going to happen about this Republican form of government. And again, this is all experimentation. Nobody really knew what to do as far as putting together a brand new government. You had these individual states that all functioned in different ways. So the first order of business, of course, was to elect a president who would preside over the convention. It was unanimous that they picked George Washington. And of course, he would go on to become our very first president of the United States of America. He is the only president to be elected so unanimously. I don't foresee that happening again in the near future. So anyway, so there's George Washington for you. Obviously, the most important thing that they accomplished, though, through this convention was the creation of the United States Constitution. The Constitution, of course, set up our government and all of its wonderfulness. Again, all of this is copies of stuff you can see in the classroom. The big thing I want you to get out of that, though, is at the Constitutional Convention, they set up the United States Constitution and assigned or elected George Washington as our first president. All right, again, let's cover a couple hundred years in just a few minutes, guys. A few things you need to know about. Of course, the United States of America started off as these 13 colonies. Americans began to spread into territories further west. Started off in places, for instance, here in Kentucky. But eventually, America was able to purchase other lands, including very famously the Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson oversaw that, basically doubling up the size of the United States of America. Americans wanted more space to spread out, which is why they moved to places like Texas and Florida and Oregon, and would move to these very dangerous, unexplored areas in order to have land to start families. So anyway, your book talks about this a lot. Immigration, of course, began to grow. People from all over the world were coming to this new country. So you saw places like Chicago and New York, which just in a matter of like 20 or 30 years would like double in size. So it's pretty incredible to see how much movement, how much America changed and was able to adapt. The United States became a credible world power. I mentioned the War of 1812 a minute ago. War of 1812 doesn't accomplish a whole lot, but again, it reestablishes that America is able to defend itself. A lot of the other European countries weren't really taking the United States seriously, and the War of 1812 kind of set up it's like, hey, you know what? They're a real power in all of this. Okay. Of course, there's the Monroe Doctrine. I won't talk about that, but basically, James Monroe came in and warned the other European countries about countries in the Western Hemisphere were not just, they were basically off limits to European powers. There was the Mexican War that took place in 1846. Again, I'm going over all of this. You don't need to know all of it for your quiz that's coming up. You might need to know it for a test next week. Now, the next big event, of course, in American history, of course, is the Civil War. I should point out the Civil War primarily started with issues beyond slavery. But of course, slavery is the main issue here. Now, most of the people who bled and died and fought in the Civil War did not own slaves, neither in the northern side or in the southern side. But that was the main issue here. And of course, the southern argument was that this was a part of their economy, that if slavery was abolished, that would damage the way things were done in the South. And of course, in the North, the abolitionists such as Abraham Lincoln and other Republicans during that time period, which I should point out, the Republican Party was primarily built to end slavery. So in the North, they were fighting to do away with this injustice, this evil in society. I'd also like to point out that your book doesn't really cover this a whole lot, but one of the great reasons for the Civil War was because of a revival that had broken out, that was breaking out, that led people to believe, you know what, slavery is an evil, it goes against God's word. So that's one of the reasons that people were fighting against it. So anyway, Civil War broke out between the North and the South. Interestingly enough, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. His election as president pretty much solidified the fact that they were going to war. The southern states were not happy about him winning in that very contested election. They put up as their own president Jefferson Davis. Just an interesting tidbit. You guys know I'm a huge Kentucky guy. I love my state. I love the Commonwealth of Kentucky. I've got my Kentucky pictures in the background, including the Wildcat up there. Both Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln were born in Kentucky. Kentucky actually was neutral throughout most of the Civil War. They wanted to remain neutral. The South wanted them to join with them. The North wanted them. It was a primary area. Going into the Civil War, Kentucky was one of the wealthiest states in all of the United States. After the Civil War was over, Kentucky finally eventually sided with the Northern powers. And they're going to be in one of the poorest states as a result of all this, because even though they didn't take a side, it damaged them greatly. A lot of battles were fought and on and in between Kentuckians. So anyway, Abraham Lincoln, of course, was president, led America through the Great Civil War. Of course, he was assassinated right after the war was over. His commander, Ulysses S. Grant, would go on to be president a few years later. Of course, Ulysses S. Grant was the one who accepted Robert E. Lee's surrender. Robert E. Lee was the general of the Southern military. And anyway, so not important. Most important thing you need to know here, of course, is the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, and then you guys need to know the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery. And you guys can look at that, of course, as a copy in our constitutions. Some other wars here worth mentioning: Spanish-American War. Again, you guys are going to take U.S. history at some point. I'll trust that you guys are going to go back and look at that. Another issue that your book brings up is the Second Great Awakening. Second Great Awakening, I really wish we could have had class this week, because Second Great Awakening is a really fascinating time period that affects us a lot. Because one of the places the Second Great Awakening actually broke out was right here in this area. You guys can actually go to the Red River Meeting House, which is right outside of Russellville, Kentucky, and you can visit the place that one of these great revivals broke out. It broke out all over in Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee, but we do take a lot of pride that one of those main meeting places was here in Kentucky. And this is where revivalists would ride around. They would ride on these horses from area to area, and they would preach these revivals. And we basically saw this great revival all throughout the frontier. And like I said, primarily that took place in places like Kentucky, and a lot of people through the Methodist, Presbyterian, and of course Baptist evangelists. A lot of people were led to Christ during this time period. Anyway, all right, guys, I will try to make the quiz as simple for you as possible. I'm going to assume that you don't have your textbooks with you. Everything that you should be able to answer, you can do so online. There is one question, though, that you will not find anywhere online, and that is based on this room that I'm in. So I'm in my man cave right now. This is where I watch sporting events and stuff. Kentucky won tonight, which was a nice change of pace. But behind me, there is located a poster that represents the national championships that Kentucky has won. They've actually won 8, but if you pay close attention here, there's only 7 banners. And that's because this was printed a few years before Kentucky won their last national championship in 2012. And that is going to be question 10 on your quiz. It's going to ask you what banner is missing from Mr. Menser's poster behind him. And the answer to that question is 2012, 2012, not 1998 or 96 or 58 or 48 or anything like that. Okay, it's going to be 2012, 2012. All right, God bless you all. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. No homework this week. Take the quiz, and then you're done. God bless. Have a great afternoon, good evening, all that, whenever you're watching this.